Hello everybody, my name is Phil and I run a social media page called The Tudor Tours, looking at all aspects of the Tudor era. Most of it, of course, is completely gruesome, as there was always something bad happening. Normally, people losing their heads. Anyway, you are probably here as you are studying the Spanish Armada. Without doubt the most powerful fleet ever assembled and one of the greatest threats of invasion England has ever seen. Now this video will look at the tactics used by both sides, so the Spanish and the English, the weather and other factors which helped the English win what looked like was inevitably going to be a battering by that ultimate fighting force of Spain. So get your notepads ready, as there is, I feel, a series of events which helps the English overcome the Armada. So firstly, let's look at who is in command on both sides. Now Spain was ruled by the most powerful man in the world. His name was King Philip II, whose empire was vast. His motto was "the world is not enough." Basically, this guy just ruled the whole world, pretty much. And his first in command was a man called the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a man who had literally no naval experience whatsoever. He also suffered with seasickness, so probably not the best person to be in charge. But his second in command, however, was the total opposite of that. He was an experienced admiral, and his name was Juan Martinez de Recalde, a man who you really wanted on your side. Now the English, of course, are ruled by Elizabeth I, and her first in command was Lord High Admiral Charles Howard of Effingham, a cousin of the Queen. Again, very little naval experience. You find throughout history that people of status end up getting authority. They have no experience in it whatsoever, but for some reason they're in charge. That's just the way it was. But the second in command for the English was a man I'm sure most of you have heard of before. It was a man called Sir Francis Drake. Francis Drake was an experienced pirate. He effectively was the English version of Recalde. You will also see later on the relationships between the first and the second in command on both sides will play a huge part in determining the outcome. So the plan for the Armada set out by King Philip on paper looked a piece of cake, looked simple. 125 ships, full of men, full of cannon, 16,000 soldiers, 7,000 sailors were to sail up the English Channel to meet with the Duke of Parma. Now the Duke of Parma was waiting in the Netherlands with a further 27,000 men. Now the Duke was to sail out into the Channel in 300 barges, so smaller boats, and meet the Armada. From there, they would then land in Margate in Kent and make their way to London. When they're in London, of course, the likelihood is they would assassinate Elizabeth. It looked pretty simple, doesn't it? But we'll come back to it later on because things aren't as simple as they first seem. Now the first problem for the English was they knew the Armada was coming, but didn't know when and where. England was on high alert and had around 100 ships waiting in Plymouth. Unfortunately, these ships were not battle ready. The English also had another 30 ships waiting in Kent. Now I will mention at this point, everything I discuss going forward happens over a 12-day period. The Armada was not fought in just one battle. Now, today we have motor-powered boats, we have GPS, etc. But hundreds of years ago, you didn't have any of these things. You are totally reliant at the mercy of the wind and the tide. Now, the Armada arrived and the English were stuck in Plymouth Harbour. They were trapped. Now, Recalde wanted to attack the English, but Medina Sidonia overruled that decision and wanted to stick with the King's plan and just sail up the Channel. But this was probably the first mistake from the Spanish. What do you think? Recalde, an experienced commander, was basically saying, let's attack. He was sure that they could destroy the English before this even started. But no, the Spanish continued to sail on. But when the Spanish next caught sight of the English, they expected to see them in front of them, defending, but in actual fact, the English were behind the Armada. They were almost trying to chase them out of the Channel. Now the English were always worried that the Spanish would anchor. Now that would be difficult then to attack such a huge fleet, and the men on board the Armada ships could get on smaller boats and land in England. But in reality, the Spanish never wanted to anchor, but the English didn't know that. They didn't know each other's tactics. But when the first time the two sides met, the English used a tactic which was never been seen before, something completely different. Because normally at sea, you get close enough to the enemy ships. You board those ships and you have a good scrap and a good fight. Now that's what the Spanish wanted, and that's what they expected. However, Drake and his men stayed far enough away and just bombarded the Spanish with cannon fire. The English ships were lower in the water and narrower, which makes them quicker. They're better at manoeuvring, and particularly during a battle. Now both sides had about 20 to 50 cannons on board, but the English cannonballs were better. They were cast, meaning they were of the same size and the same consistency. Now the English fired in this first battle around 2,000 shots, with the Spanish firing less than half. Now the Spanish can't fire as quickly as the English. Now why is that? Well, I'll come back to that very shortly. However, with all of this bombardment of cannon fire, the Spanish remained in good formation. This just shows it's going to take a lot to break them. Now, Recalde, unfortunately, again was frustrated. He wanted to turn and put up a greater fight, but Medina Sidonia again refused, and the Spanish continued on their way away from Plymouth. The English didn't really cause much damage, although the Spanish had lost a couple of ships, more down to their own fault. Now, later that night, Drake, being the pirate he was, boarded one of the abandoned Spanish ship, where he found 50,000 ducats, which effectively is a couple of £1 million in today's money. He took all the ammo and all the gunpowder, which again was great for the English because England was poor, Elizabeth I was extremely stingy and extremely tight with money. The English didn't have the ammo to keep fighting the Spanish the way they were. But whilst he was on board the Spanish ship, Drake noticed that the cannon on the Spanish ships were harder to manoeuvre. They were clunkier, they were bigger. Well, the surrounds of the cannon were bigger. And they were also harder to aim, so they were slower at reloading and probably not as accurate as the English. The English could fire up to 5 times faster. But Drake boarding this ship was a very risky business indeed, because he actually scattered the English fleet in doing so. But this risk paid off. Now, some of you might be thinking at this point, what about the Duke of Parma and his 27,000 men? Well, think about it again. No GPS, no modern technology. How does the Armada get a message to or from the Duke of Parma? There is no communication. It's a complete communication breakdown. The Spanish have no way of knowing when or how they're going to meet. Even if a messenger made it ashore, how would they find the Armada again in the middle of the English Channel? Now, the Spanish think that the English have the upper hand. But the interesting thing is, the English also at this point thought the Spanish had the upper hand. But on the 2nd of August, the Battle of Portland Bill took place. Now, one of the English commanders, a man called Martin Frobisher, took 6 ships into Portland Bill and tried to lure the Spanish into some of the treacherous waters. Now remember, the English know the Channel waters by the back of their hand. They were trying to cause a trap. Now Drake attacked from the other side and Howard went into the middle. Again, a big cannon fight, but once again the Spanish kept good formation. Just shows how good they were. But then they continued up the Channel. The English again are low on ammo and gunpowder because they just haven't got the supplies. And they could send word to the mainland to get backup and supplies. Messages could get back to Queen Elizabeth fairly easily, and they'd be there in less than a day. But no extra supplies were ever sent. Elizabeth was just one stingy woman. The following day, the Spanish approached the Isle of Wight. This is dangerous for the English, as the Isle of Wight is poorly defended and not far from the mainland. If the Spanish take the Isle of Wight, this could be game over for Elizabeth and England. This would be, I think, the most decisive battle of the Armada. Sidonia went off plan, surprisingly, and wanted to anchor in the Solent, which is the stretch of water between the Isle of Wight and mainland of England. This would put the Spanish in the best position possible. They could sit there and wait to hear word from Parma, but also not far away from mainland England to invade. The English knew this was going to be the fight of their lives, and Frobisher once again put his ships in between the Spanish and the Solent. The English attacked the Spanish once again from all angles, and this time they moved even closer to the ships to try and cause some more damage, but not too close for the Spanish to board the English ships. But this is where the weather now kicks in, because the wind and the tide started to push the Spanish into shallower water off the Isle of Wight, which would be absolutely catastrophic for the Spanish. So Sidonia got the Armada out of there and again sent them back into the Channel, once again to the annoyance of Recalde, who wanted to stay and fight. The Spanish are now back in the Channel and have had no word from the Duke of Parma. Their only option now was to get to Calais in France. From there, they're only 21 miles away from the Duke of Parma, and surely are now in the stronger position. If Parma arrived with his men, surely that was going to be bad news for the English. Now the English were 2 miles away from the Spanish, sitting off Calais, and the Spanish really now, you'd think, have the upper hand. But unbeknownst to the English, the Duke of Parma wrote to Sidonia to tell him his army was far from being ready. So they've got no army, they've got their 27,000 men. Spain is now trapped. So Drake and Howard came up with a master plan. They were going to use fire ships. This is setting ships on fire and letting them sail into the middle of the fleet. Now think about this. The worst thing when you're at sea on a wooden boat, on a wooden ship, is fire. Now 8 ships were set on their way, fire ships were set on their way into the middle of the Armada. 2 were towed away by the Armada, by the Spanish, they got them out of the way, but 6 carried on. In sheer panic, many of the Spanish ships cut their anchors completely loose. Now this means they will not be able to anchor anywhere else. That is a huge, huge mistake by the Spanish. The Armada was scattered, leaving 5 ships to face the English. And the English now had backup, because those 30 ships I mentioned earlier that were situated in Kent arrived. They've got more shot and more cannon. But for the first time, the English outnumbered the Spanish. The Battle of Gravelines begins and would last for 8 long hours. The weather was foul, it was misty, and clouds of smoke from the cannon. The rest of the scattered Armada, the Spanish ships, turned back to fight. The English couldn't inflict the killer blow in this battle or throughout the whole of the Armada due to the lack of powder and ammo. But the wind pushed the Armada, it was pretty much broke at this point, into the North Sea. The Armada was over and England was saved. Now I appreciate that was a lot of information to take in such a short space of time. But remember, you are entitled to watch this video as many times as you like. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you follow me and see me on the next one. Goodbye.